Thanks a lot for joining me today. Today I'm going to be talking about paragraphs in Drupal and how to build out layered and structured content. And let me hide a couple of these things because that chat window is getting in the way. This one. That's much better. Okay. Cool. All right. So my name is Eric Simbrat. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, which is that beautiful background right there, where it is currently very hot and full of allergies, which I'm currently suffering from, so I apologize if I cough any. What I do, I work in Drupal at Georgia Tech. I'm a web manager for the College of Engineering. I also help steer the Atlanta Drupal users group down here, as well as I'm a graduate student at Georgia State University. So I use Drupal both in my professional life as well as in graduate school and my personal time as well. If you want to learn more about me or find information about me on Twitter, contact with me. You can follow me or tweet at me at @esimbrat or visit my website, web.com. This is where I'll note it's a WordPress website, so don't judge me too much. But it's super easy for me to update and add blog posts, so that's why I use that. But today I'm not here to talk about WordPress. I'm here to talk about Drupal. So with paragraphs, my goals for today are pretty straightforward. First, we're going to talk about the history of how you can do content globbing in Drupal. And by content globbing, I mean taking a number of fields and combining them into this little Play-Doh mess that then you can reuse across your Drupal website. Secondly, we're going to define what paragraphs are and how they are currently utilized in Drupal. And then third, of course, we're going to learn how to actually set up structure and show these paragraphs using things you've likely used in Drupal for a long, long time. And then, of course, finally, I'm going to point you to some steps. So how to move forward after you've played around with paragraphs, where to go next to do some additional expert user things, and to find out how the community is using paragraphs. So before I begin, just a quick disclaimer. I am not a coder by any means. One of the reasons why I like paragraphs is because it does give me an alternative from doing custom code. So that's why I love it. So I am happy to answer a lot of questions, but if you have any crazy custom module ones, that may not be the best point of contact for it, but otherwise I should be able to help you out with any questions you might have about paragraphs or incorporating it into Drupal. So let's get started. So the best way to get started, honestly, is just to go back in time and think about where Drupal has been. And that's where we need our time machine for. So in order to see what's now available and why it's so great, we really have to know what we had to deal with in the past and the pros and cons of all of those. And so we go back to ye old Drupal 7. And that may feel very archaic to use in Drupal 8. And for those like me who currently do not use Drupal 8 full-time, it feels like the future, but this is Drupal 7. This is how it feels to some people. How have we built content types in the past to be scalable for complex pieces of content? Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 provided a couple of different outlets, all of which had their pros and cons. And more importantly, how did these actually fail? So what parts of each of these features ended up being more of a headache and a chore for us as developers, as site builders, as content editors, or as users on the website? So of course, the easiest thing is just building a bunch of fields within each content type or within each entity for every permutation of the kind of content you want on your website. Now that may possibly work, but of course, it's messy. Once you get into large numbers, once you have a content type with pages and pages of fields that you may not necessarily be using for every piece of content you're building, that may be pretty ugly. And then, of course, what if you're having to build and maintain multi-field data, like let's say a bunch of journal articles where you have a number of fields for each aspect or part of a journal article reference, and you're having to use its delta or its position on the list, whether it's the first item, the second item, third item. I've actually had to do that once because I did not know any better, and yes, as you might imagine, it is a horrible way of playing with that content. There are better things than that, including things like field collection. Field collection, if no one's ever seen it before, it basically allows you to couple or combine fields into distinct entities that you can just display as a field on an entity like a content type. One limitation, however, is that you can only point to one field collection type. So let's say you wanted the flexibility of having people display a video or an image. With your field collection, unless you put a video and an image field and all the configuration for that within the field collection, you couldn't switch between the two and have the flexibility of having someone go back and forth between. Also, your options for actually editing the entity of the collection is somewhat limited, and it doesn't have the flexibility that you might need for your end users to actually take advantage of it. So people saw field collection, saw what it could do, and saw where the limitations were, and entity reference came up as a great way of going around that. Entity reference, of course, allows you to couple, basically create links between entities and use a field as the referencer to another content type or entity type within Drupal. And of course, entity reference is meant to be reusable. So you have pieces of content, entities, whether they be taxonomy terms, pieces of content, user accounts, and you're able to reuse them either through a select list, a bulleted list, a radio button list, or a or an autocomplete field. However, so of course you can create multiple ones at once. Entity reference allows you to create that one to N, or one entity can reference multiple pieces of content on that field. And then of course, using the magic of views, you can jump through that relationship if you want to go through and find that field or find a piece of content within that reference entity. However, one thing which I've seen, which has really driven my content editors insane, is that it requires you by default, and that's why the little asterisk is up top in the very top right, it requires you to define the children elements, that is the elements that appear in the reference field as the dropdown, before you create the parent one. As an example of what we do here on Georgia Tech's campus, we have a news and events website in Drupal that acts as our media repository for those kinds of news articles and events. And for each of those entities of a news or an event, you can attach images to them, but as every one of our content editors knows, you have to create every piece of media as its own standalone entity. So, you know, content, add content, picture, create 5 of those before you can create the actual article that it goes to. We're not really a fan of that. And of course, one thing that may be great or may be horrible is that because you want those to be reusable, those entity references then appear alongside all your other content in the administrative screen for under your content, all content, which if you're using lots and lots of custom entity references that aren't meant to be reused, you end up being very, very sad and very frustrated. So that being said, you know, there are positive things for each of those, and not all of those solve all of our use cases, but they all target one specific area that works incredibly well. So, of course, what if we could combine each of the things we like out of those different entities or those modules or field types and combine them into something that we can use and love for all the reasons that we talked about without a whole lot of those negatives. And so as a quick primer, just to go over what I just talked about, you know, having fields, super easy to set up. Extendable and embeddable, so the field collection and making it super simple, and then of course stackable and flexible to allow multiple variations and reusability there, which is where entity reference comes into play. And of course, that's our perfect mix there. And if you aren't surprised by this, your perfect mix is of course going to be paragraphs. That's why we're talking about it. So that's where the magic is. So of course, the question is, you know, what does paragraphs do and how do you use it? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before I go into the nitty-gritty of paragraphs, it's worth noting a very, very quick primer on where you can go to find out about paragraphs, as well as what it's compatible with. So paragraphs is, of course, available from D.O, Drupal.org/project/paragraphs. There are, I believe, stable / semi-stable versions for both Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. I haven't touched Drupal 8 in about a month or so, but the last time I remembered I was able to install paragraphs, and it worked pretty much exactly like I would expect in Drupal 7. So if you play with it in Drupal 7, don't expect a whole lot of things to change in Drupal 8. There's a couple of small changes on how you reference it, but that's more about Drupal 8's changes in how they categorize revision content. That's about it. Like I was mentioning, it's friendly for both Drupal 8 and Drupal 7, and honestly, if you get comfortable with one, moving to the other one's really not going to be a seismic leap in terms of things you have to remember. And of course, like we were mentioning, paragraphs is specifically built for flexible and multi-field components for engines. So the first question everyone has when they hear about paragraphs is, well, what kind of content can you build in paragraphs? What is it great for? And what have people found successes for on it with playing around with it as it's matured as a module in the Drupal community over the last couple of years? The first thing that I hear, especially in the higher ed realm, which is where I'm at, is the wonderful slideshows we all love and hate. So rather than having to create multiple pieces of content on your website for a slideshow that will appear on an individual page, paragraphs allows you to pretty much build out a specific field that can be customizable enough for you to create a slideshow for each entity, specific to each entity, which is great. That means you have one place to find that slideshow. You don't have to be looking through a content type of slideshow slides. All of it can be done in the same place where the content resides, and you have one place to really edit it, add it, and extend it. It's super great. It's a lot different than what I have to deal with right now, which is not optimal. Adding metadata is very important here. So let's say you wanted to have an extendable page social media sharing, and you wanted to be able to link to specific areas there. Because of Paragraph's ability to basically have multiple variants that you can select from, you can be very choosy and specific on the kinds of metadata you want to attach based on the kind of content you're putting in. So whether it's a video or an image, the kinds of accessibility metadata you want to attach, without having to worry about having all those fields there if they're not going to use it. Heavy duty fields are another example, and of course I like to bring up the great example of publications for faculty members in academia. So as you know, when you reference a citation for a specific academic area, there's usually a very, very specific format for how that citation is done. And of course, you know, for faculty and staff, they may know the format. That doesn't mean that they really necessarily follow it every time they use it. So instead of relying on your content editors to know that and be able to standardize that across every journal article they reference across your website, you can build in a paragraph that handles a journal article and gives you all that flexibility to build out all those individual fields without being hassled by it. So if you want one page to have 25 journal articles, it's not going to be as heavy as them just copy and paste in and hoping the formatting works. And one thing that I've been experimenting with that has worked out really well for paragraphs is creating multi-layer content. So having your, which I can go over in a little bit, I actually have a couple of slides for it down the road, but it's pretty much leveraging Paragraph's ability to stack, so you can have paragraph referencing another paragraph, and basically build out a container and then content within that container so that you can play with things like layouts, widths, heights, and be able to deliver that full screen experience when you want it. And of course, your variable data entry, if you have lots of different kinds of data you want, but you don't want to necessarily actually require all that data, just allow people to insert that. Different features. So let's say a good example of this would be similar to the nested content. So the variable data entry would be for the actual content within the container. So if I wanted to show a giant quote, or a full-size image, or a full-size video, or just a WYSIWYG field that we all know and love, I want my content editors to be able to pick and choose which one they want for each part of the page. And of course, you know, your mind is the limit here. So if you have other ideas or other experimentations you want to play with, paragraphs may be perfect for this. So next I'm going to go over really how you configure and install and start using paragraphs and working with it. In paragraphs, very fortunately, does not appear to be a whole lot different than what you're already used to working with in Drupal, which is really great. You know, it's very similar to the other kinds of entities that you deal with really one big exception. From your structure, and of course this is in Drupal 7, under structure, you know, where you would only go to content types or entity form types or your taxonomies, here you just have something called paragraph bundles. And that allows you to pretty much either view all the paragraph bundles or types you have on your website or add a new one there. And of course, a paragraph bundle is just like any other entity, like a content type. It's got fields. It allows you to play with how the display when you're editing or creating the content is, as well as playing how the default display of the entity shows up as well. So if you've gone to content types and edited a content type and look at those tabs up where manage fields and manage display, it's very much the same thing here. So in this example, you know, I've got a paragraph bundle that is just simply a button. So I've got some text, a URL, and where it should live on the page. And that's pretty much all this paragraph bundle does. And yeah, so if you've ever messed with an entity, this looks very, very similar to what you're already doing. The difference here is how it's actually being used and where it connects to the entity type that you're actually messing with. And of course, that's what I mentioned here. So the difference here is how you actually connect it. And it's very similar to how you've done entity reference or field collection. With one caveat there, so in field collection, you usually had to define the field collection field before you could actually go to field collections and create it. With paragraphs, you can do it really any way. You can either define the field first as a paragraph and then go create the paragraph, or you can create a paragraph bundle and then create the field and attach it there. Either way, whichever way you do, you're still going to have to go in there and attach that paragraph bundle to that field regardless. So in this example, we've got a paragraph field in this content type called global : buttons, and it's just a paragraph embedded within there. So it's a field I created, and then when you create or edit that field, you get a drop down that tells you what kind of paragraph bundles you want to use. And so in this case, if you don't have any of this selected when you first create it, it's going to show everything. But if you want to only use one type of bundle on that field for that entity type, you just do the checkbox there, and it will only use that one when you're setting it up. And one of the fun things about paragraphs is it actually sort of takes in some of the issues that users have found with content types by default, with that your buttons for saving or for moving forward may not be entirely clear if your workflow is a little bit different than what Drupal's going with. So if you're leveraging, for example, content types as a form that's going somewhere using rules, so paragraphs allows you to pretty much define what you want your buttons to say when you're creating a new instance of a paragraph of that bundle. So instead of it being a paragraph, it could be a button or multiple buttons. Another thing to note here is, of course, the default edit mode and the add mode on the bottom. Those two are super important. So the default edit mode is pretty much how you want each paragraph bundle entity to show up when you're editing the page. So when you create or edit a paragraph within a content type or an entity type, you can either have it open, which shows all the fields that are already on that existing content and have the ability to create a new one without clicking any buttons. You can have it be closed, which means it shows very, very little, and to actually edit or add one, you have to click some buttons to do it, or preview, which just uses that default entity display type within the paragraph and shows almost like a teaser for it using the teaser display type, and then when you click edit, you get the same thing that you would under open. And add mode's pretty straightforward. We'll go over that in a second, but when you're creating a paragraph, it's super simple. So by default, it's gonna look like this. There's my buttons, and it says no buttons have been added yet. Click the button before, which is just add new button. Now, if I were to add something, it would look very similar to this, in that there's a button there, and because I'm using the closed paragraph type, it's not showing all the fields that are associated with it, but if I click edit, it's going to show all the fields that are there. So in this case, the export all applications, going to a URL and showing what site it's on. And of course, so configuration is pretty straightforward, and with paragraphs you can actually sort of build in some inception like I was talking about, where you can bundle them into a container and content area. So as an example of that, I have this random page for the dean of my college, and each container within this is a paragraph. In addition, each container object is also a paragraph. So as a good example, in the pull quote in the very middle of the page that takes the full width, that has one paragraph object, which is the container, and that's creating the background color, how wide it is, where the padding is from the very left to the very right of the page for the text, and then the container is the actual content that lives inside of it. And this is a great way for me to build out this custom layered content without having to build a panel for each of these and basically say, I want to put this node here, this view here, and then have a button down here using this view. It allows me to do all of this custom page with the multiple different areas, all showing different preferences, all from one entity, just super awesome. And so as an example of how it looks on the back end, I've just got my container and content. So if we take a look on the right-hand side, you've got a container field, which is that first layer of the paragraph with the fields associated with that. And that's open by default. That's why you're able to see all the settings for it. And then for each piece of content within inside of it, that's the second layer. Each of those are using the closed, where it just gives the type of it and allows you to edit or remove it from there. And the buttons down there are just each of the paragraph types that I enabled for this field. So within the container, for the second layer paragraph, I said you can add an image, a quote, raw HTML, you can do WYSIWYG and all that good stuff just by pressing those buttons. So to visualize this a little bit easier, you've got your first layer, which is your container, you've got your layer 2, which is your actual content, and then of course it just repeats itself down the page. So if I was to scroll down, it's more of the same, but you can stack that and have it be super simple for your content editors to build out a fairly complex page without ever having to touch panels or multiple entities throughout the website, or find out where those entities are coming from. They're all being referenced right here with them able to edit it and configure them to their needs. And so the question that sort of pops up after I sort of tease that is, how do you do display with paragraphs? And the short answer is, well, Drupal renders paragraphs just like it does any other entities by default. And you all have probably experienced this, but you know, Drupal's default display is very straightforward and generic. There's not going to be a whole lot of bells and whistles on it, but it gives you the flexibility and minimal markup to be able to take it and do whatever you want with it, whether you want to, for example, attach it into something like views. So pass that paragraph or that content or that entity type into views and go through each paragraph and do something wild with it. Or going through panels, having panels actually handle that and pass on information that then can render that paragraph in a specific way. Of course, you can also do it through your theme template, both in Drupal 7 and in Drupal 8. And then, of course, you can also use the various other display suites. Panels is usually my main go-to one, so that's the one I have most experience with. But given the fact that it works as an entity, I imagine any of the competitors to panels will also do the exact same thing that panels will do. So in the page, in the multi-tiered page of the container and the content example I showed a little while ago, you've got a pretty three-tier structure here. So in lieu of creating a custom tipple.php in my theme, because I am awful at writing PHP, what I've decided to do is actually leverage panels to basically rewrite that content type display using panels UI, which just makes my life a little bit easier for this project. So panels is the first place. It's basically taking the entity ID there, which will be the content type, the specific node that's being looked at. It passes that on into a view, which basically renders the container using a bunch of custom markup that allows my CSS to do all the fancy stuff it does. And then the view passes the paragraph entity ID to a second view that then handles the display of the actual container content, which would be like your WYSIWYG fields, your video, your images, to give it that beautiful look. And the way I like to think about this is that there's not a real right way of doing this, except for one, what you're comfortable with, and two, based on your design. So if your data design is going to where you have a lot of it embedded in code, so let's say a lot of your paragraph design is being done in code, the display of the paragraph entity is being done in its own specific Temple.php file, then why not just put the rest of that in there because you're already going 90% of the way with your configuration. I would say go with what you're comfortable with and really let the flexibility on what your goal is determine how you want to display it. The reason why I'm using panels in this example is this is a proof of concept for Georgia Tech as a campus because we're using basically blocks and block references to sort of do the same thing, and we're finding a lot of limitations with that. So looking at paragraphs is a great alternative to doing that because it's taking that entity reference or block reference and thinking about what kinds of flexibility we can do on a per page basis. So of course, there's a lot of different ways you can use paragraphs depending on what your use case is for your project. You could be doing it for the structure of your individual pages. You could be doing it for your content within each page. You could also be doing it for the specific kind of media or metadata within your page, whether you're wanting to be SEO-centric, accessibility-centric, or just wanting to show your media in a better way. Paragraphs is well built for that and also allows you to have that flexibility on a per entity or per content basis. And of course, one great thing about paragraphs is just like anything else that is bundled under entity, they've built in support for it to be exportable in Drupal 7 via features. So if you have experience doing that and working with that to deliver, export and import your structured code into various other Drupal sites, where you don't want to have to run imports or clone a database or do anything else like that, you're able to do that, and it works surprisingly well, just like you would expect with anything else, just like the features. There are certain caveats to it, and sometimes it doesn't work, but it's about the same as pretty much using features for any other entity export. So as a great starter, you have paragraphs, but there are some additional helper modules that allow you to take paragraphs one step further. And this sort of does some minor revisions or minor customizations to paragraphs to give you a little bit more flexibility for your coding or for really your styling for a lot of it. So there's a couple of sub-projects. These are really the biggies that show up on the Drupal.org page for paragraphs. There are a couple more, but these are probably either the most maintained or the most used or most familiar of these sub-projects. The first, of course, being paragraph packs. And these are basically, if you're finding it difficult to get started with paragraphs and figure out use cases on how it's actually being used, Paragraphs Pack is a great way of getting started and taking a look at paragraphs and seeing what you can actually build with it. It provides you some examples as well as working with some common use cases for you to take a look at what is available and what is easy to build within paragraphs. And you can either build off of that or just use it as examples and build your own paragraph based on an example that's there. Now, in the common phrasing of Drupal, we have classy paragraphs, which allows you to provide a custom predefined CSS class to each paragraph instance. So this allows you to basically build in some workflow for when a paragraph of this type is created. Please show this class within the default markup for that paragraph instance. So if you were using it very basically as its default paragraph display type, this will provide a CSS class for you to be able to basically build out in your theme some different CSS to basically go through and style those fields or that entire container in a specific way. This is a pretty simple alternative to running your paragraphs through views and writing the markup yourself through there, or using your theme's entity rewriting through templates to do that. So it's a great way to get started if you haven't had much experience in that area, or if you want to see what the default way of predefining CSS classes or specific classes, the kind of paragraph instance or what bundle it's using, it's a great way to get started. Then you have edgy, which if you're using Bootstrap, does give you the flexibility to have edge to edge or left to right capability for a paragraph item. This, of course, if you're using Bootstrap, is super great. If you're using another thing, it may not be as powerful as what you're looking for, but if you're already leveraging that, it takes it one step further and gives you that flexibility. And one important thing, which I did not think would be super important until I started thinking about it, is of course the default values for a paragraph. And this isn't so much the default value for a field, so much so than defaults for when you create an entire paragraph bundle. So it allows you to basically set a, for when you create a new paragraph instance, so let's go back to that example of having the paragraph with the buttons for each kind of content we want. If we want the default values for image to be a default image, some metadata for alt text and a description, to have that available there so that our end users are forced to either use it or rewrite it. It's a great way of forcing that if you want to set some standards in place, as well as if there are things you're going to be rewriting every time you create a piece of content. One awesome thing about paragraph defaults is that it also has bulk, replace, and apply. So if you have something you want to replace, or if you decide you want to add some defaults down the road, paragraph defaults also allows you that ability to sort of go back and clean up what you've already created, which is a great way of sort of catching up to what you're doing. Another feature would be basically, and this is the last module, would be actually going through and providing a unique identifier, so an ID class for that paragraph, that you can then use CSS to basically go through and style it just the same. But in this case, you're looking not so much at the type of paragraph that it is, that specific unique paragraph bundle entity. So that specific one you create there has its unique ID, and you can play with that one specifically because you're targeting only that instance on that entity. So beyond that, we have a couple of community examples. Of course, there's not really a central way to find them, but I know, for example, institutions in higher ed are looking at using paragraphs to replace some of their outdated content areas. And while I wasn't able to find any examples that I wanted to demo, I think Google or Drupal.org will be your best friend for finding examples, exportable features, or just general products built using paragraphs there that you can then look at and see how they're using it to the max. So as a quick primer, this is what we've gone through today. So I've put off what field bundling options exist in Drupal, and that's what it did historically. So that's your field collection, entity reference, paragraphs, and the pros and cons of each, and how they work, how they don't work. Then, of course, we went into paragraphs 101. So what is it good for? What is a paragraph? How do we use it? And then, of course, went into a very quick primer on paragraphs, which is what I'll go over after I complete these slides. We'll go into a little bit more detail, and I'll take your questions, and we can talk about topics or areas of paragraphs that you have questions, concerns, or comments about. And then, of course, finally, looking at paragraphs and how to extend it. So what modules exist out of the box to give you a little extra flexibility for markup and for default values. And with that, these slides are complete. So does anyone have any questions before I go into a demo of one of the projects that I'm working on with paragraphs? I'm just going to close out of this just in case. I don't know if it'd be best for someone to come up and ask it specifically, or just type into the chat box on the computer. I don't know what was done for the other sessions, so I'll just leave it into the preference of the room.
Say that again?
So for questions, I don't know if it's easier for you to ask it out loud because the microphone may not be able to pick it up that far, or whether it's best for you to either come up to the laptop on your end and either ask it there or type it in the chat box for the conference application.
This room's small enough, the mic's good enough. If you speak so that everyone can hear the room, we should be okay. But in the remote session this morning, we had a few people, unless you have a big voice, that I had to repeat questions for.
Cool.
I'm happy to repeat questions for you, if needed, but so.
So far, so good. I know I couldn't hear a couple of folks when they were chatting before the session, so I just wanted to cover my base in case it was a little grainy. But does anyone have any questions?
No.
All right, that's pretty straightforward. So let me see if I can bring up the project that I'm working on here within the College of Engineering here at Georgia Tech. So one of the issues that we have on this, and can everyone see this by the way, or is this far too small for what you're needing? Okay, we'll start with this. If anyone has any issues with seeing any of the fields or anything, just let me know. So as a quick example, here is what we have currently. So we have Georgia Tech's website, and I know there's going to be security updates. Please don't judge me. Oh, look at that. I feel much better about that. Okay, so when we first built this website in Drupal 7, the best method we had to do this multi-tier content. So as an example, having content up here and accordion down here and buttons right here was to use panels for this. Love it or hate it, panels was what our vendor used, as well as, yep, there's that security update, as well as what works for us. So we basically built panel variants for each of these. And while that works well for me because I understand panels, for my content editors and pretty much anyone else editing the site, I don't want them to have to come in here and worry about how to actually structure out their content here. So how to build out something that's 50%, in this case the body, how to build out the sidebars, the statistics, our accordions here, in an easy way. This isn't easy to my end users, nor is it easy for them to understand how to add a new view accordion using this add content. And I think anyone who's ever touched this knows that if it's your first time using this, finding the right view or display for this takes a little while, kind of like how it was the first time you looked at views. It seems a little counterintuitive until you start clicking through each and every menu item over there. So while the content may look great for our content editors, building a lot of this, especially when it comes down to our individual pieces of content like these individual views, it seems a little counterintuitive to have our end users try to edit these. So in the last couple of months, we in the dean's office over here have been experimenting with using paragraphs for this. And of course, we only have a couple examples, and please ignore the fact that I misspelled engineering, the college where I work. It's a test website, so that's the excuse I'm going to use today. It's of course correct right there. But we're looking on how to basically rebuild that so it's super simple, and that building complex pieces of content where we can showcase things like quotes and additional pieces of content aren't confusing or counterintuitive. So like I was showing in the slideshow, what we have here is we have a content type called a page. It's one content type to rule them all. Which is super great because a majority of our content types here at Georgia Tech, the way we're doing it right now, I don't want to show that, but I think it may be imperative too. 2.6. That's not correct. I knew it wasn't. How we're actually building these multifaceted pieces of content right now is something that our end users aren't exactly a fan of, and it's exactly for the reason that I discussed earlier, in that we're using block reference, so you have to create the child entities within a page before you build in the parent entities. So as a perfect example, if you want to add a block to the right of a page, say example here, this multi-purpose page, you have to create each of these individual blocks before you ever create this demo multi-purpose page. And for that, some of our end users, and including myself, aren't a fan of that. So once we get down here to referencing these, our users aren't a fan of having to go through and build this here because it's counterintuitive. And also, figuring out which content type to use, what the difference is between a horizontal landing page, a multi-purpose page, or a vertical landing page can be counterintuitive to someone that doesn't work in websites a lot, which is a majority of our end users for maintaining the content. I want my websites to be as accessible and as usable to as many users as possible, and for this, that will sort of curve and adaptation for getting used to this is way too much. It's the same with the panels too. So with this, what we're hoping for is actually hiding some of the complexity within your individual container here. So within this content type called the page, we've got the container, which is just the paragraph here, which is pretty much the container for the different elements on the website. And that's pretty straightforward. It allows them to add any number of containers that they want, and they can drag and drop them up and down as they see fit. And that container is honestly pretty straightforward. It's just using a bunch of different fields, which are just taxonomy terms for what color scheme, so that we can maintain 508 compliance. Preset widths, so I don't have any end user typing 1,000 instead of 100 or 10 instead of 100, and being able to sort of use some preset defaults to give them the flexibility and yet keep it very standard for what they're working with. And then of course, in here we have the second layer of paragraphs, which is just your content there as well. So that paragraph is a bit more complex than the first layer, so we've got a couple of different paragraph bundles that I'm checking off, pretty much all the other ones except for the container. And then I'm using that there to basically allow them to select which one they want, and then show them, in this case, nothing, because the preview doesn't have any fields showing up there. And so that's the two layers there, and then each of the individual bundles for the pieces of content are just what you would expect for it. So the quote's just a piece of a field for the quote. Your WYSIWYG field is just going to be a WYSIWYG field, and in this case, we have the ability to upload files and images to attach to that WYSIWYG field, so that you can find out where the supporting content is for that without having to go through CK Editor. And video and photography will be the exact same thing, which is that it's hosting all that there alongside the metadata, like the description, and then having all that within the paragraph container. And then for the actual display of it, what's going on here in a fairly obtuse example is I am using panel's ability to override the node template. I'm creating a variant for the content type basic page. And then basically what I'm doing here, once my website wakes up, is overriding the title with a title, showing some header information, your tabs for your administrative stuff, and then showing the paragraph container view, which this view then references another view for the individual piece of content. And so look over here, you've got your container and you've got your content views. And those are the only two views that I'm using for this. And those are pretty much just going through and taking that paragraph and then rewriting the HTML so that it can do some beautiful CSS to it. So I'm jumping into all those taxonomy terms I was talking about before to grab those classes that are predefined, so I don't have anyone mistyping a CSS class and the styling not coming out. And that gives me this kind of layout where I can have this header that's being generated, the first paragraph, which is just a WYSIWYG, the quote over here that has a preset background color and text color. So we take a look. Oh, of course, the developer, this one's not going to show up here. I make this a little bit bigger. So if we take a look in the view, all I'm doing here is basically creating the container and giving it some classes for what color it is, what its width is, what the padding is, as well as a unique identifier for it. Just passing the ID of the paragraph there. And so that's a very, very unique example of how I'm using it for layouts. In other ways, I'm just using it to basically predefine set fields for, I'm just going to show a production website, but that's okay. I hopefully won't make a mistake here. And we're also using it for targeted pieces of data, like a, oops. Oh man, these security ones are making me sad. So for some of our forms, we're creating bundles for what is references, really. So let me wait on this website to wake up a little bit. Our web hosting here at Tech isn't exactly the best right now. All right, so for recommendations on a form, I'm using paragraphs for that. And the reason why is because I want to have all this information be available and grouped together so that when a student submits a teacher recommendation or an application recommendation, I can use rules to go into that specific paragraph bundle for that application and send an email to that recommendation and be able to archive that in administrative view. So I have their name, their job title, their employer, a unique identifier, and then their email address. So those are the two big ways that I've been using paragraphs. It's worked out extremely well, and it gives me the flexibility to do things like this, which for workflow, for entity forms, and for a lot of the programs we do in higher education, it works out great, and it solves a lot of the issues that I've had with things like field collection and things like entity reference, both in terms of how it is for the end user as well as how it is for the site editors. That being said, does this toggle any more questions from the audience?
Not seeing anything. Oh,
I got one. A couple of times
Yes, in the back.
You said that your content authors had a hard time with entity references because you had to create the child before the parent. For that, I've used Entity Connect module to solve that problem. Can you kind of compare the experience you've had with using paragraphs with Entity Connect and how it's a better experience for the, mostly I'm interested for the content authors than anything else?
Yeah, so actually what's funny enough, okay, so a little primer on Georgia Tech politics here. By default, our default installation does not use Entity Connect, which would be super awesome because when you're playing with a demo here, and for those who haven't seen Entity Connect, what it does, and I'll show an example in a second, is if we, for example, do I have an example that is easy to use? I may. Over here, if Entity Connect was enabled, there would be an add/edit button here, which would allow you to add a new article here or edit an existing one and basically go through and not have to worry about it for an entity reference. However, do I have an example of that somewhere around here? You're asking the hard questions. I know I have one, but whether it's, you know what, let's do this. If there's one, it's probably underneath the school, and I'm gonna give it a try. And survey says, nope, that's a big lie. I have no idea where they are. But there is an example of that. And what so Entity Connect, the pros and cons for that. For Entity Connect, when you go through and create that child entity for the parent one, it actually takes you to a new screen, which is basically the create entity screen for that child node. And so you add all that just like you would in a normal instance if you were just creating it from the Drupal admin. And then when you click save, it goes back to the parent entity. So it'll say, you know, you've created this awesome little call out here. Now you're gonna go back to the page where you came before. And I'm so sorry, I'm trying to locate where this might be because I know I've created it, I just can't find it and it's gonna drive me insane. So I'm gonna hope that I've done it on this website because I know I've done it elsewhere, but finding it, oh, here it is, awesome. So here's an example of Entity Connect. So you have slides, which is another content type. In this case, we have something called a news story slideshow slide, very detailed, I know. And what you can do here is you can either reference a pre-existing slide, you can edit it by clicking edit and then clicking the one that you checked off here on a list, or you can create the add new. So in this case, if I wanted to add a new slide, I would create this. This is a test slide on my production server, sad face. And then when I click save, it shows up on that list. And now I'm back to the parent entity that I just created. And I need to remember to delete that. So that's the workflow for that. With paragraphs, the difference there is that you're all doing it without ever having to leave this screen, which there are pros and cons to that. If you want your end user to basically move to a different screen to create that piece of content and then come back, basically treat them as two separate pieces of content that are only coupled to this checkbox, that's the great way to do it. And more importantly, Entity Connect allows you to reuse this. So let's say you wanted these slides to be reused across different pages, then yeah, Entity Connect would be better because paragraphs doesn't do that. However, if you want these to be individual, I don't want this slideshow to have all these different faculty members for 25 different pages that I'm sorry, my allergies are out of control. You don't want 25 slides for each piece of content and then have 20 pieces of content. That makes your drop-down view, your checkboxes, or your autocomplete a bit more hectic for you to use, depending on your end users. I know mine tend not to like the autocomplete because they don't standardize the way they create the titles on the content. So finding that content sometimes can just be clicking each letter of the alphabet and seeing what pops up and seeing if that meets the requirement. So that's why I like paragraphs. It does have the downside of not being reusable across multiple pieces of content. But if it's individual to that page, that's the benefit you have, is that it has that tight coupling between node to which that paragraph is being defined. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. While I take a sip of soda, does anyone else have any questions?
Has the paragraph
That sounds
module been around?
Oh, I'm sorry?
Has the paragraph module been around for a long time?
You know, it's kind of funny. So the name itself is fairly generic. So back when it first came out, probably about, I would say, well, you know what? Let's do an adventure. Project. I want to say it's been around for maybe 2 or 3 years. However, that may be a bull-faced lie. So rather than give you an incorrect number, we're going to check the releases. That seems a lot further back than I would think. That doesn't seem far back at all. I don't believe that. Oh, there we go. Why is that one showing up? Okay, because it's the dev one. I see. It's been a long week. So 2013, so a couple of years. What I remember about when it first came out is it wasn't widely used because honestly people were having trouble locating it. So when you look at paragraphs, when you were first Googling paragraphs plus Drupal, you've got pages about, you know, WYSIWYG and building out paragraph tags in HTML, and it was somewhat hard to find. However, as it started to get used, and as some of the features that differentiated it from field collection became more apparent, that's when it became to get a lot more widely used. So as it hit its first release candidate, so that's when it became, and then kind of over the last year and a half or so, I've started to see more examples of people actually leveraging paragraphs to build this multifaceted, multi-layered content for the kinds of long, multi-area content that we see from websites. That's all the trend nowadays. And that's almost what sort of precipitated the rise in paragraphs, as web tended to trend more towards that realm for mobile development and the all-in-one pages. Paragraphs sort of rose up at that same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, absolutely. All right, there's no more questions left. I have about 5 minutes left, so I'm happy to stick around here and answer any questions, either one-on-one up front or if you have any in the audience. Otherwise, unless there's anything else, thank you for joining my virtual session. I'm very happy to have hopefully given you some information that you can go out and use paragraphs for your Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 websites. So thank you for letting me pass the knowledge on.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Absolutely. You want me to hang out here? Or,
Does anyone want to come up and ask questions one-on-one, or? I'm not seeing any takers, so I'll let you go and get back to your day.
Thank you very much. Have a great one. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.